This is The Civil War was unnecessary to end slavery, debunked. So let's get into some libertarian analysis of the Civil War. These arguments I'm presenting, I've seen quite a bit on Facebook and other social media, and they're kind of in the fashion right now. So let's look at what they're saying. About the Civil War, some libertarians and other anti-government groups like to argue that, number one, that the war was unnecessary to end slavery, resulting in hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. They say that this is because slavery was unprofitable and outmoded compared to factory ownership and the Industrial Revolution, which is true. And in fact, most Southern white people did not even own slaves and even suffered as a result of impossible competition for wages against black slaves who were paid nothing. And this is also true. Then they use those 2 points to assert that if left to their own devices, Southern states would have banned slavery on their own because of market forces. And that's what I'm going to be debunking. The other argument libertarian historians are making today is that the war pitted a hostile northern aggressor against a defensive, and in some variants, a morally just South. After all, most Southerners who died in the war and even fought in the war owned no slaves. And that is also what I'll be debunking today. So here's a metaphor. It's a dark metaphor. So some men kidnap, repeatedly rape, and enslave your daughter, reaping the profits of her labor. You go to the police, and in this bizarre universe, the police accurately tell you that the law says what the men are doing is perfectly legal, and thus the police can and will do nothing. Another man says, don't go to the kidnapper's house yourself. As you probably know, being a Wall Street banker is much more profitable than kidnapping. Let them figure that out. Let them go be Wall Street bankers themselves, and eventually they'll release her without any need for violence, and they'll just go become bankers and make a lot more money. Market forces will just take over. Things will resolve themselves if you give them time. And a very obvious question, why is the man's argument in number 3 just terrible? Just take a minute and think about that. Why is this man's argument kind of insane? Given that what the law is in number 2. Why is the man's argument in number 3 just terrible? All right, so let's make the connection. Timing ethics. When someone has seriously wronged you and continues to do so, the moral obligation is on them, not you, to stop immediately. And it's not on you to wait until they realize what they're doing is wrong. And American slaves were routinely denied freedom of movement, and they were beaten, and they were raped, all under the protection of the law. Waiting for Southern whites to realize what the South was doing was ethically wrong or not maximizing profit violates the above rule. Innocent victims should not have to bear the burden while they wait for their oppressors to evolve. And again, making the connection, rationality does not mean action, and poor white Southerners' complicity with slavery. This is something that the libertarians who are taking this position really overlook. That something is rational does not mean people will do it, and vice versa. People routinely, continuously, and knowingly commit irrational acts all of the time. In our metaphor, maybe the kidnappers just like being kidnappers. Maybe they don't know how to be Wall Street bankers. Maybe being a Wall Street banker would take too much time and effort, whatever. Just because, being a banker is more profitable than being a kidnapper, it's true. You could make billions of dollars being a Wall Street banker, just pushing buttons all day. Doesn't mean that's going to happen. That it would be rational for the South to get rid of slavery from a financial perspective does not prove in any way that they would do that. And in particularly, it does not prove that they would do so in a timely fashion. So libertarians might argue that eventually market forces would make factory work more profitable for rich people, and so they start investing in factories. But that might have taken 200 years. We have no idea how long that would take without some kind of intervention. So there is no burden of proof being met here by the libertarian thesis that because market forces were making slavery less and less profitable over time, that somehow the South would just break away from doing that practice and again in some way do it in a quick time fashion. It could be 50 years, 200 years, we'd have no idea. Or, by the way, let me just say, or possibly never at all. And let's talk about poor white Southerners' complicity with slavery. Non-slave owning white Southerners overwhelmingly supported slavery regardless of the fact that it may have been irrational and against their own best interests. And it's essential to note that culture matters. So that Southern identity primarily was rooted in one's race, gender, and class, whether that was rational or not. That non-slave owning white men were above all black people in the South's social hierarchy gave them a sense of superiority and pride. They had bought into the system. Non-slave owning white Southern men also supported slavery because it gave them something to yearn for. Through social and economic advancement, they strove to be slaveholders one day too. This is what they wanted to be. This is the people they looked up to. They didn't want to get rid of slavery, they supported slavery. And they were very much complicit in slavery, even though they did not own slaves themselves. And so it's just, basic primary document evidence. From reading their diaries, speeches, and letters, we see almost no evidence of any significant group of Southerners pushing for abolition by the dawn of the Civil War. Abolitionist groups in the South just did not exist. Or, sorry, white abolitionist groups just did not exist in the South on the dawn of the Civil War. There are virtually no white abolitionist groups in the South on record, and Southerners believe such views to be utterly radical and against God's will. On the contrary, there's abundant and overwhelming evidence that white Southerners, slaveholding or not, believe slavery was essential to their way of life. And look at some basic slavery statistics in the antebellum South. The slave population in the South rose every decade from 1790 until the Civil War. It goes from 650,000 to 850,000, 1.1 million, 1.5 million, and so on. Between 1850 and 1860, the dawn of the Civil War, the slave population in the South again went up by 750,000. And the numbers clearly indicate slavery increasing in popularity in the South, not decreasing, and certainly not going away. So with that in mind, obviously I think I've demonstrated pretty clearly that the Civil War was necessary to end slavery in any sort of any sort of reasonable time period compared to the grievous injuries of slavery. Let's look at some of the rebuttals and debunking them. There are many rebuttals, but I'm just going to take two of the biggest ones that I've heard and just debunk them very quickly. First thing I've heard is that the North didn't fight the war to end slavery. At least at first, this is true, but it doesn't support the libertarian thesis. The fact is the Civil War did end slavery regardless of the North's initial intentions. Remember, we're trying to debate, was the Civil War necessary to end slavery? That the North initially entered the war to bring back the South into the Union and not to end slavery is irrelevant. The North's intentions don't really matter towards this argument. The point is that the Civil War did end slavery and was necessary to do so. And the other rebuttal I want to debunk is that the North was racist too. And again, like the first one, this is also true, but again, doesn't support the libertarian thesis. Except for a small group of abolitionists and black people themselves, most Northerners were to some degree racist, like Southerners were. That fact, again, does not change the fact that the Civil War ultimately did end slavery. That the North were bad guys in the sense that they had less than pure motives with regards to race does not mean them fighting a war which ultimately ended slavery was not necessary to end slavery. The two arguments above are ad hominem attacks on the North rather than addressing the issue at hand.